This is Al Jazeera.
US President Donald Trump and his wife Melania are in isolation after testing positive for COVID-19. Displaying mild symptoms of the virus, a White House doctor has said that Trump received experimental antibodies and that he remains fatigued after the diagnosis. How long the president's isolation is set to last, well, that depends on how unwell he becomes. US health authorities say people must self-isolate for 10 days after a positive test, and even longer if they present symptoms. And even after that, Trump might have to test negative twice in a row, with those tests done at least 24 hours apart. The crucial thing that he is being airlifted by helicopter, obviously, to this facility, because we understand the Walter Reed is just a 20-minute drive from the White House itself. So the fact that he is being airlifted suggests that there is an urgency to the situation, and the priority is to get him there as soon as possible. We have Peter Mathews with us now, Professor of Political Science at Cyprus College, joins me now by Skype. What are your initial thoughts of what we're seeing play out? Because, of course, the timing of this is absolutely crucial. I mean, in many ways, what the president is COVID-19 diagnosis. It really just reflects what's happening in the country and in much of the world right now. But the fact that it's happening just a month out from the election.
It's the October surprise. It's a horrendous situation and very critical, obviously, and it depends really crucially right now what happens the next couple of days or even a few hours from now. The fact that he's going to be transferred to Walter Reed is a major development. He could have been quarantined in the White House and waited it out there, but there's something else that's going on here. Now, it could be they're just taking very cautious about him being president, but still, you have to take these things very seriously, and you have to look at what is being put in place by the administration to make sure there's a smooth transition. Either the president stays in office smoothly and can carry out his work and his duties, or a transition to the vice president, which would call into question the 25th Amendment. There's provisions in there to do that. But it's very, right now we have to wait and see just for a little bit more.
In terms of that potential transition, even if it is just temporary to the vice president, of course, that statement from the White House keen to emphasize that the president will be working out of the presidential offices at Walter Reed. Now, of course, it's not clear that his condition will allow him to be able to do that. But how quickly could we get a decision on whether he is incapacitated? I mean, do you think it will be more determined by whether he is responding to treatment, whether the fever deteriorates, possibly if he is conscious or not?
Well, there are two ways to go. And there's the precedent. When President Reagan had to go in for surgery, he signed a statement, a letter saying that he's turning over power to Vice President George H.W. Bush for 8 hours. And then he would resume it after that. And it worked out pretty smoothly. That's one way to do it, where the president voluntarily signs a statement. Another way is when the president is incapacitated, and it seems very clearly that he is, the vice president has to lead on that and call the cabinet together, and then the cabinet has to vote by majority vote to proceed to transfer power to the vice president. And then when that happens, the president can challenge it. If he's able to do that, he can challenge it. Then it goes to Congress to be voted upon by a 2/3 majority in each house to transfer the power over. So there are a couple of options here. It all depends on how President Trump comes through right now as far as his physical health goes. And we all do wish him well. He's the head of the country right now, the state. We need someone in stability at this point in America.
Speaking of wishing him well, Joe Biden has made a point of saying that it can't be a partisan moment. Everyone needs to come together. They're taking down any negative ads of the president after his COVID-19 diagnosis. What do you make of the way he's playing this?
I think it's very prudent by candidate Biden. I think it's going to help him to do it this way. There's probably no other way. If he continues those ads, it just complicates matters and it throws gasoline on the fire. We have a president right now who could be ailing, and to have these negative ads, I don't think it would really be helpful to Joe Biden's campaign. So I think it was a good, prudent move, and it could actually help him in the medium run. We'll see what happens then. But the key right here is to make sure that any kind of change or transition has to be flow very smoothly, because the United States has given to the world, this is from the very beginning of President Washington's office, 8 years in office, and George Washington could have stayed on and become president for life. He didn't do it. He stepped down, and that was the precedent for a smooth transition of power. Now, it's maybe a little early to talk about that right now, but also we should have that in mind as things develop, and could be very rapidly. I mean, COVID can attack overnight, and in 1 or 2 hours, someone can deteriorate very readily and rapidly. It's happened to many, even young people.
Yes, exactly. What's fascinating about this virus is that it isn't just one single set of symptoms that plays out in the same way. It can really vary depending on whether a person has any pre-existing conditions, depending on age, sex, and other things. Now, of course, with President Trump, based on his lifestyle, his gender, his age alone, medical experts have suggested there is a vulnerability to the virus. But the other thing that will cause some concern is that he was seen at campaign rallies, shaking hands, no social distancing, not wearing a mask. Will this come as a surprise to many people there in light of that?
I think most people would say that watching his behavior and how he was just ignoring all the precautionary principles, and then with Hope Hicks, she was his right-hand woman, as I say. She was someone who was with him every day practically, giving him advice on policy, on procedure, and she was right next to him, and they were not wearing masks in many cases, most cases. You saw even Jared Kushner and Hope Hicks and others walking along to Marine One with no masks, a couple of feet from each other. The president's been holding rallies with 35,000 people at a time, many of them not wearing masks, and he was bragging about that. It's just incredibly ironic. This president who just neglected to take this seriously from the beginning and to actually come down and say at the beginning in February, when he found out the seriousness of this, to say we have to start massive testing, massive contact tracing, and massive quarantining. He didn't do that. The South Koreans did it. The Germans did it. Other countries did it, and they got it under control. So this is very tragic, and it's tragic for him on a personal level and for Melania as well.
Well, that's right, because we were hearing the President Trump, particularly in the initial stages of the outbreak, downplaying the severity of the virus, but actually sort of continuously, virtually throughout the year, throughout the time that we have seen this disease take hold in the United States and much of the world. He denied the severity of it, declined to wear a mask, and even mocked Joe Biden for wearing a mask just recently. Could this perhaps, if there's one silver lining to all of this, perhaps change public perception about the virus in the U.S.?
It certainly could, and it should, and it depends on the people. There may be a few hardcore supporters of his who believe that this is all, a manufactured crisis, and they may continue not wearing masks. But I think the vast majority of Americans will say, including a few people who changed their mind, who thought the other way, that it wasn't such a bad thing, they'll say this is real. Our president has this now, and especially if something detrimental happens to him, God forbid, then it'll really wake people up. And I'm hoping that the leaders of this country, the medical leaders, will be listened to by the politicians. They haven't been listened to respectfully in any way that would actually carry out the policies. They haven't been. The politicians have to take these medical leaders, the experts, seriously now and start immediately pursuing policy that we know works. And I hope this will change the country. It has to do that.
That's one of the fascinating things about the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in countries where you have populist leaders. We have seen official institutions being undermined. We have seen quite a hostile atmosphere in some cases towards scientists, towards evidence-based science. And I suppose that approach has cost lives.
Absolutely. It was a very horrible approach that these populists took. Bolsonaro in Brazil, President Trump, people, I think some of the Eastern European people, dictators or leaders who did that, they didn't pay attention to the scientists, the evidence, the reasonable and rationality of the whole approach that should have been there wasn't there. And it's been a tragic consequence for the people in these countries. The Brazilian rate is huge, and so is the American one, the highest in the world. Brazil's, I think, number 3 right now. And this has to be taken seriously, and other countries have done that. Look at South Korea. They only have about 400 deaths in South Korea, even despite the fact that they have 57 million people. The U.S. has 6 times as many people as South Korea, but it has 10 times as many deaths. In other words, we have 200,000 deaths. If we had the same number of deaths as South Korea, the same rate of death, we'd have only 2,000 deaths, not 200,000. And we didn't do what South Korea did. We should be learning from other societies and countries that actually worked it, where science was king or queen. And we should be doing that right here. And I hope this will change things.
Is it likely to, though? I mean, what we're seeing now is quite unprecedented for a president to potentially be incapacitated, but certainly to be unwell in this way not long before the election. But before this happened, before President Trump's diagnosis with COVID-19, did you get a sense that there was an awareness of how other countries were coping with the virus in terms of widespread testing and contact tracing, and perhaps a dismay with the way in which this administration has dealt with it?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because the person at the very top, President Trump, should have been at the forefront of educating the people, of telling them the truth about this, and going on all media, including not just cable news, which a lot of people watch who are intellectually, involved with these things, but the common public had to hear from the top leaders that this is serious, and here's the science behind it, and here's how you fix it. And they should have gone and filmed South Korea, investigated countries like Taiwan who got this under control, and shown it documentary to the American people, the millions of people who didn't believe it. I didn't get the sense that things were changing. In fact, we were going backward. Our numbers went down in June. They started rising back up in July and August. And they're opening schools up, the K-12 children in schools right now. And this is something where there have been thousands of infections. Children some of them may be asymptomatic, but yet they can carry it to their parents. And that's an example of this offhanded attitude that started from the top all the way through the society. And I think it's about time some of these politicians in Congress speak up as well, if the president won't do so.
Yeah, I guess what's interesting, what's really been a challenge there in the US is that given the country's size and its fragmented federalist system, there's been a very inconsistent approach to the virus across the country, which on the one hand makes sense because you will have different hotspots at different times, but it seems as though Washington really abdicated responsibility.
It really did, and that was the Achilles heel to decentralized government, in a sense. It's got a national federal government in a lot of 50 states and then local counties, but that could have been coordinated much better if we had leadership at the very top. Look at the Federal Republic of Germany. Germany has a federal system with many states, and yet the federal government and the state governments coordinated, acted as a unified team in doing massive testing, massive contact tracing, and massive quarantining at the beginning, and they kept their numbers down. And of course, there's some resurgence there, but that's to be expected. But the numbers per thousand are far lower than here. We could have done it differently. It didn't take a unitary system like South Korea or like Taiwan, although those systems were able to work very efficiently more quickly. But we could have done it. It has to do with leadership, not a lack of inspiration and leadership at the top, and just disbelief and just denying science. That's the real problem.
All right, Professor. Well, thank you very much. Hope we can talk again, because it's going to be a busy night. So it would be good to pick your brains again. But for now, thanks very much. Appreciate it.